Landen Hatchett announced his return to Montlake. There's a whole lot of roster movement going on.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes for Inside the Huskies of Fan Nation Sports Illustrated. I'm the site editor over with Huskies Wire. Make sure you check out all of our written work. Locked On Huskies is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers, if you join today, you'll get $200 in bonus bets off your first bet of $5 or more if it wins. And you can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So Lars, there's so much going on right now. Let's start at the top here because we've got to record this for scheduling purposes on Sunday afternoon. So we're going to cover everybody that could or may have already committed over the course of this episode. And let's start with the first news that we heard this morning. And that would be, he's going to be a sophomore, but we're expecting him to redshirt this year, Landen Hatchett, where a lot of the everydayers in our YouTube comments have said, all right, well, we need to see some improvements along the offensive line. We need to see more bodies along the offensive line. This is as good of a pull, or not really a pull, just a retention really in this case, that you could see at this point in time in terms of just guys that are available, what's going on. And this, even though he might not play this year, this is a huge win for Brennan Carroll and the Huskies.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it when we were running through the offensive line, Drew has a party, Gardner Millar. If you can put Landen Hatchett, now again, to your point about the injury, but kind of just even for the next 2 years, that's probably your line, or at least the left side of your line, right? Because Drew has 2 years of eligibility left, Gardner has at least 2. Landen obviously definitely has more than 2. So having all three of those guys kind of penciled in for the next 2 years, that allows them, the coaching staff, to kind of think, okay, now we can start to build out the depth, build out the position, not necessarily have to go find a portal guy. And Landen, if you take away Parker Brailsford, Landen might have been one of the more impressive offensive linemen, just that we weren't expecting, because we talked about it before the season where we both expected big things from them, but Parker exceeded his expectations. And I think even Landen exceeded his because he played guard and center at multiple points throughout the season. And then unfortunately had the injury after the Apple Cup during the bowl preparation, during that point in the window. And so the fact that he had to fill in a reserve role for after Mateo Mele went out, we saw how valuable Landen can be. And I mean, whether or not this helps with his older brother Garen, I think just getting Landen regardless, I think especially because he has more than 1 year of eligibility, unlike Garen, where I believe Garen has at least 1 year left. I don't know.
He's got one left, yeah.
Right, exactly. So Garen, you can kind of see, okay, maybe go, somewhere else big, kind of almost like Mish and some of these other guys are doing, right? Where, hey, I got 1 year left. Let me just go big or go home, right? You can't fault kids for that. I know I see people on Twitter saying, oh, well, if you're a Washington kid, how are you leaving? It's like, you have to understand it from an 18 to 22-year-old's perspective, where you guys grew up Washington fans, so you graduated from UW, all that. But when you're an athlete and you have the ability to go to an Ohio State or to an Oklahoma for 1 year, right? You've already played your time in Washington. You took them to a national championship. All these guys that are leaving can say, hey, we at least took Washington to a national championship. We did our part. It wasn't like, right, we went 3-9 and now we're just trying to find better opportunities and not give it a shot. No, these guys gave it a shot after going 4-8 and 21. So, and especially to get Landen after all that, even with his older brother, to keep him now in the fold under Jedd Fisch, I think it speaks volumes to how well Brennan Carroll is viewed as an offensive line coach. I think that, because he's going to be the offense coordinator as well. But I think his bread and butter, almost like Sherrone Moore, right, is kind of, built in the, hey, I am an offensive coordinator, but we're going to build it in the trenches. I'm not that quarterback, wide receiver skill guy necessarily, because those skill guys can't do much if you don't have a line to block, as I think fans have clearly seen.
So I've a couple of things where the first thing is, and especially when we talk about Landen Hatchett, his mom put out a great tweet saying this would be Garen's fourth coach to play for at Washington. Yeah. And it's a little exhausting to do that over and over and over and over again. So you can't necessarily fault a guy like that for going to look elsewhere. Exactly. But then the other thing is to build on Landen where, as we said, where he might not play this year. We'll see what happens with his injury. But on top of that, we're going to see a lot more just a lot more bodies come in after the spring portal along the offensive line, where there's a lot of movement that's still going to happen there. But this is just a great starting point where, if you can go get Pakifi now back, that'd be a really big announcement. But there's so much more to come there, where just any building blocks that you can take right now are good ones. But this one just so happens to be great with, as you said, the level of play that we saw from him as a freshman is huge. And then, let's say, which I would expect him to do, to redshirt this season and still having 3 more years of eligibility to build on for him, that would be just crucial. And then the other one, that we kind of want to talk here right about, just right off the top, is BJ Green, where it was reported that he didn't end up taking his official visit to Washington this weekend with the new coaching staff. And, there were some other rumors going around about what it might possibly be, where, we won't necessarily go too far into those, but this is probably a big, as big of a loss as you can say that Washington has suffered so far, where, he was only going to be here for 1 year, but this dude is just an absolute game wrecker on the interior of the defense or exterior really of the defensive line. And it's just, you can't sugarcoat it in any way, where, he was going to be a huge contributor for Washington this season. But at the same time, when you kind of take a step back and look at everything that's gone on with his recruitment, you can't necessarily say you're surprised at the same time either.
I was going to say, you could have said for a different reason, what if it was academic? Not that he's a bad student. I'm just saying maybe he needed to wait until June or July to be able to transfer. Then you're thinking, okay, well, maybe for his sake, why don't I just go find an opportunity that I can go and enroll in March, right? Like if you just roll with even if you just roll with that theory, right, which actually is a plausible theory. It was kind of just unfortunate for how it shook out for Washington, but after the coaching change, I was going to be surprised if BJ Green ended up sticking out with Washington, because And here's the thing about, I'm not going to go on too long of a rant about this, but kind of similar to, in a similar vein of, Washington players like Nate Kalepo and Guerin potentially going elsewhere for their final year. Mish Powell being another one going for their final year.
Issa Turner, same vein.
Well, no, but I'm saying kids from the state of Washington. Was like,
sure.
Put on for the state of Washington. The other side of that coin is the Jabbar Muhammad's, right, where he had no previous tie to Washington, right, before 2023.
Sure.
Right? Went DeSoto, Texas, Oklahoma State, decides to go all the way out to Washington. You are getting these are mercenary transfers, okay? There's a difference between you were bred from Washington, you went to Washington, why don't you stick it out? Okay, you have 1 year left. Okay, those are separate, right? Versus the mercenary. You can't be mad if a mercenary leaves, right? Because you brought the mercenary in to do a job. So it wasn't necessarily a surprise, it is a big loss, right? In terms of where he would have projected in, but I don't think anybody was truly penciling him in at Washington after the coaching change.
So I agree with you there, and that's a tough thing, where we're going to jump into way more about this, where we're looking at guys like Russell Davis II and Isaiah Ward, who are both visiting campus this weekend, along with a whole bunch of other guys that are going to be on campus, are on campus right now, taking an official visit and could commit soon. But BJ Green would have just kind of been the piece that tied it together, where he probably would have played a very specific role on this team, where it's a lot of obvious passing downs, line him up on the interior and just let him go to work. But that doesn't necessarily change the fact that, this was that mercenary that you talk about, where he would have been really huge in just helping the roster turnover, as being like, we know we have this guy for a season. Like when you talk about Ratumana Bulabulavu, who's still out there unsigned after opting out of his Washington NLI, where that's that same kind of player on the interior, where I don't know if we expect him to be that this year, but down the line, where you just look at it as, this is the game wrecker from the interior of the defensive line that can really help break everything down. And then when we look at Ephesians Prysock, who committed, another guy we're going to talk about later on, in Tacario Davis, where if you have those two dudes on the outside, you can probably just feel really comfortable sending extra guys on a blitz. And then if you're sending multiple guys to block somebody like BJ Green, there are going to be openings elsewhere. And with that being said, let's jump into some of these other guys that are going to be on campus, and we might hear some good things from soon. Right after we send a message to our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, all the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers. So let's, just because we just mentioned him, let's start with Tacario Davis, where you and I have heard some good things on that front after he entered the transfer portal for a second time, and this time with a do not contact designation, where it feels like Washington is one of the only teams that he might be considering at this point. And this would just be, especially after the Jabbar Muhammad loss, where I know you and I kind of saw that one coming, where, we kind of expected it might be Texas, might be Alabama, or it might be Oregon. But getting both of those guys into the room would be, after the Prysock commitment on Saturday, would just be a huge win for this secondary moving forward. And it not only goes to secondary coach John Richardson, who can kind of let these guys go to work and obviously still work with them, help them get better, but focus a lot of his time on the young guys that you and I have talked about, where it's the Curly Reeds, the Leroy Bryants, the Caleb Presleys of the world, where he can spend a lot more time helping those guys develop. And let's say Davis and Prysock are here for 1 year and then they're off to the NFL. That would be just a huge win for Washington's defense moving forward.
I agree. Although the more that as you're kind of spelling it out, right? So you're basically getting your two starting cornerbacks, and then you have Devon Banks coming back, and then you have
Elijah Jackson.
But then you have Elijah Jackson, right? So now I start to wonder, does somebody get crowded out in that room, right? And then, I'm not saying you're weighing one or the other, right? But maybe that's kind of what the coaches might be doing, right? Because with Tacario going, to your point, in the portal the first time, then withdrawing his name, and then going back in with a no contact designation, it kind of says, okay, now I know where I'm going, but I'm not announcing it yet. And Prysock makes his announcement before him. You would kind of assume, okay, well, is there another shoe to fall on the other side of that coin? Because again, you do want to add talented cornerbacks, but I think we've seen over the years, you don't want to also lose your depth at that same point. So if Richardson can find a way to balance all four of those guys, that's a perfect 2 to roll into the season with, knowing that Banks is going to want to be a starter. Jackson is definitely going to want to be a starter. And then you're bringing in 2 of your former starters in Ephesius Prysock and Tacario Davis, where those guys are probably going to be your 1 and 2 cornerbacks. So it's hard in this day and age, right, to kind of keep all that talent in the same room. So that's what I'll be curious to see if they're able to get all 4 of those guys to stick and no one transfers out of that room. Then that room has a chance to do some special things next year, because, going back to your point about the defensive line, if you don't have as much pressure, but you have lockdown corners, your defensive line looks a lot better, because now your corners are able to buy you that extra time. And again, if you don't have a good defensive line, the quarterback will be able to kind of not feel that pressure right away. But the better your corners are in staying on coverage, or as Chuck Merrill likes to say, stay on body, then you would have a way to get a better pass rush. So that might be what the coaching staff is thinking. And I wonder, maybe, we're going to talk about it later, the linebacker commit from San Jose State, does he go and play a nickel, or do you slide as Elijah Jackson or Thaddeus Dixon over to that role, or maybe even Devon Banks? So there's plenty of talent in that room, which is, how can you make sure you maximize all of it? Because you do like the addition of Prysock and potentially Davis, but you don't want that to be at the detriment of, losing maybe either a Banks and or Jackson, right?
So I agree with you. And let's have the Bryun Parham discussion now, where this is a really big commit. Happened after we did our live show on Saturday evening. And make sure you go check that one out if you haven't just yet. But that's a really interesting piece, because I think that now, especially with the way you just kind of broke down the corner room, that he's going to fit right in at linebacker. And you'll still have probably your incumbent starters in Carson Bruner and Alfonso Tupatala, but then you can bring him in a Raylan Goforth role, where I think he's going to end up probably producing a little bit more than Raylan Goforth did, where Raylan Goforth definitely did his job, and he was really helpful in certain situations. But the nicest thing about having a guy like Parham in the scheme is he can play a lot of snaps. You can rotate guys and keep them fresh at the position. You don't have to rely too much on Devin Bryant and Jordan Whitney. And then, Kamori House, and you can probably, because he's played a lot so far, where you can probably even still rely on a walk-on like Drew Fowler, where you can have these guys in the mix and still let the freshmen develop a little bit, get them some reps here and there, but really rely on your core 4 in a sense, where, you can say what you will about Drew Fowler being a walk-on, where he turned down scholarship offers to come to Washington. So having him in your rotation is not a bad thing. And, depending how like the roster works out, I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the guys that ends up getting put on scholarship for his final year. So there are a lot of things to discuss there, but he adds a whole lot of speed, and he's got a really good nose for the football. So he racked up 106 tackles as a junior at San Jose State during this last season. So this is somebody where you can expect him to be a pretty productive part of the rotation.
No doubt. I think the only thing that I'm intrigued by is just the height. Because when you think about a middle linebacker, inside linebacker, Carson Bruner's 6'2", 6'1" at least.
Sure,
Alfonso, I think is 6'1" or 6'2", but maybe closer to 6 foot. But it kind of I made the comp on. I don't know if it was a live show or one of our other shows where I thought Ben Burke-Urban, right, where there's a ton of production, but does he get beat in pass coverage? And so I think that, to your point, could be why we saw a ton of rotation at the linebacker position this past year. We don't know who the linebacker coach. I believe we don't know yet. At least maybe not publicly. There we go. I'm gonna put it that way. Right. We don't publicly know who the linebacker coach is. Nobody who was committing. No, maybe they know.
Sure,
but I would have to imagine that you wouldn't, because you're thinking about it in terms of the Big Ten, right? Can you get away with having a 5'11" starting inside linebacker in the Big Ten? Yes and no, as long as you use him correctly. And I think that's kind of to your point about Raylan Goforth, where you can kind of maybe send him as an extra pass rusher, or maybe send up the middle, though, right? Not as an edge rusher, right? Just kind of send him and maybe have him drop over in that middle in coverage. But if you have a nickel also helping him, because I just kind of wonder how we saw. I'm sure you kind of remember the times when look at the Rose Bowl against Ohio State, where Ben Burke-Urban is probably within like 2 inches maybe of a couple of tips or interceptions that end up being big plays. And again, it's not a slight to Parham or to BBK, right? But it's just a fact of the matter, right? Where is his best position and how is he best utilized? So maybe not as a true starter, but as a significant snaps impact guy, or maybe even next to Carson Bruner, right? Where you have a big, tall linebacker who can kind of play that SWAT down role, and then you have Parham as a rusher through the V-gap or something like that, where you can kind of, because you want to be able to maximize, because he had plenty of tackles for loss. So you can see he's an impact guy. He's not just a tackle guy. Right. If he was a little bit bigger, I would say Bobby Wagner, because he's a little shorter than Bobby, but he's a lot lighter than Bobby, which I think, again, goes more to my point about the pass rush, getting him as an athlete more so than as a true coverage guy.
So since you talk about Bobby Wagner, I think that it's only right that we bring up his nephew who's on campus this weekend, and that's edge rusher Isaiah Ward. And he's not the only one, but I really, really like Isaiah Ward. I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the guys that, even by the time this episode is released, has announced a commitment to Washington, where he would be a really productive piece on the edge. And I also think that he's just a perfect fit for everybody else in the room and what this former Arizona coaching staff is looking for here at Washington, where you look at some of the guys in the room, where you look at a Maurice Himes, a Lance Holtzclaw, Anthony James, Jacob Lane, where they all have this same, very projectable body type, especially when you look at guys like Lance and Jacob Lane. And there's a whole lot of athleticism, really long arms, and especially when you turn on Ward's tape, you see a very advanced pass rush plan for somebody who's played 2 years of college football, and some of that probably has to, come from working with Bobby Wagner every now and again. But I really like what he would bring to this room, and in an edge rush group that I know you and I talked about a little bit yesterday, where there are a whole lot of questions, not in terms of the potential of there, it's just who's going to step up? Who's going to be the guy that makes the jump in the spring of 2024, outside of who we expect to be the starters right now in Zach Durfee and Voit Tanufi? It's all right. Where are you going to get this other production from? Where we saw Lance Holtzclaw step up in the Apple Cup and get a big sack. Where we've seen guys produce in spurts. Where we saw Jacob Lane have to play on the interior a little bit, but still come through when his number was called and help out in a big way. So I feel like this is the perfect guy to get into the room, find a way to utilize him, and everything else will work itself out in the end.
Right. I was going to say, look at the total pressures he had. He was second for Arizona with 34 pressures, right? So that's almost, if you think about it, it's not exactly Braylon Trice numbers. Obviously, nobody's close to Braylon Trice, right? It's kind of hard to be what Braylon Trice was for Washington. But think of it in a similar mold, right? Where, okay, maybe you don't see 10 plus sacks. You don't see all these big, this is a nice addition, right? Or it would be a nice addition, right? Sure. But I think it's more it's again, speaking back to, if you have lockdown corners, you can have a guy that maybe just disrupts the quarterback and it doesn't result as a sack, but it turns into an interception, right? Or a bad overthrow and a 3-and-out leads to a turnover on downs or a punt, right? So again, you're just looking for guys that can make an impact, right? I think sometimes fans and maybe us in the media, we get caught up in the numbers, right? Like, oh, he's only got like 3 sacks. Like Braylon Trice, a first round pick, 3 sacks. Like, what but then you actually look at the production and turn on the tape and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, now I see it. And I also see Bobby Wagner's relationship with him, because it's like, it's how he uses his body. I think that's why he has so many pressures, is he's not just a one trick pony, right? He's not just a bull rush guy. He's got many different ways in which he can affect a quarterback.
So we're gonna stick on the defensive line, because there's another guy who actually recently picked up a crystal ball to Washington, but we're gonna take a quick break real fast. And we're going to send a message to our good friends over at FanDuel. Happy Super Bowl to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. And, as we play this, hey, as we record this right now, Jamison Williams, 42-yard rushing touchdown. The Lions are up. So that's what we like to see as the official team of the Locked On Huskies podcast. FanDuel has so many ways for you to end the season with a W or 2. Or even 3. Not only can you bet on who will win Super Bowl 58, but FanDuel also has bets for which players will score a touchdown, how many points will be scored, and so much more. New customers join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So, Lars, let's talk about Russell Davis, where that's another guy who is in the transfer portal, looks like he took an official visit to Washington, and is somebody who kind of in that same mold where I wouldn't be surprised because Arizona's defensive, the way they lay out their defense is very interesting, where when you look at it on paper, you see some interesting positions where they have a cat on one side, where that's where Isaiah Ward and Russell Davis play, and then they have an end on the other side, which is just like a heavier run stuffer, while the cat position is more of a pure pass rusher. So I'm really curious to see if that's the scheme up front, that's a Johnny Nansen thing, or if that's a just the scheme that they want to run defensively, where Davis and Isaiah Ward both play that cat position. And he would be another pass rusher, but the way that both of their body types project out, if you can get those guys up to 240, 250, and I know that's a lot to ask, it's 15, 20 pounds, but if you can get them up to that weight, then they can be more of an every down kind of defender, where maybe they believe they can do that now at 225, probably 230, around that size. But if the coaching staff might feel a little bit more comfortable with them adding some weight before they get there. But I like Davis a lot, kind of in that same vein of Isaiah Ward, where he's really productive, gets into the backfield a lot, and causes a lot of havoc. But I feel that might be it. If they get both those guys just to add to the defensive line, that might be it, especially at edge rusher. We'll definitely see more true defensive tackles, especially come April. But I'm really curious to see how that would all work out.
Right. I mean, it gets back to, a couple of different positions that we've hit on, where you just get the bodies in there and figure it out, right? I know this is I have dragged this man so many times. I'm going to give him a shout out, where Jimmy Lake said, the cream will rise to the top, right? You just keep filling up the cream, and eventually that thing's going to rise up. Somebody's going to show up. Like it might not even be who we're thinking. It could even be Maurice Himes, right? And that's not a slight to Maurice, but it could be any number of these guys who have all that potential and that kind of size and perfect fit in terms of what you're looking for, but we just haven't seen it on the field on a consistent basis. But when you get a new coaching staff, the best thing you can have is numbers, right? The worst thing you can, right, where Jedd Fisch entered was no numbers, right? Or a certainly limited amount of numbers that he wanted. But it's also, as we've been saying, make sure you're taking the right guy. You're not just waiting to say, hey, you know what, we're going to take this guy from South Alabama, we're going to take this guy from Middle Tennessee State, we're going to take this guy from, X, Y, and Z. You don't want to just take a body for the sake of taking a body so you can get through camp, right? Because there's a lot of other reasons why, but it's just not healthy for the program, right? Just to put it simply, right? It's not healthy even to have that situation like you had with the running back that I'm blanking about from New Mexico.
Aaron Dumas.
Right? Where you bring him in thinking it was logical, right? Thinking Sam Adams has been hurt a lot. Maybe he'll retire. Maybe Rich Newton retires over the next 6 months. And they didn't, right? They were all fine. So then it became, okay, now the room is too big. Now we need to move you back out. And so you don't want to be getting into those situations more often than not. So I think what they've done in the room is fine. It's just a matter of, because it's staggered, right? You still have Lance Holtzclaw. Then you get some older guys in there and kind of mix and match. And you still have Zach Durfee, which we got to see a little taste of in the Sugar Bowl. But we'll really get to see what he can do. And imagine, just think about for Washington fans, like if you're worried about the pass rush, think Braylon Trice had the mentality of like, hey, I'm just going to always be going. My motor's always going. Zach Durfee has had his motor pulled out from him without his choice this past season.
Right.
And he's going to be pissed. Okay.
Yeah,
you're an edge rusher and you're pissed. Like, it's a great combination if you're a coach, because like you don't really got to do much coaching on that.
So we've got 3 more guys that we've got to hit on really fast. So let's start with the last transfer. And I'm glad you mentioned New Mexico running backs, because we talk about Jacory Croskey-Merritt, who is a late addition as an official visit. And I went through this dude's tape last night after we talked a little bit about him on our Saturday evening show. And I really liked what I saw, where I'm really curious to see how that would work out at the running back position, because he's got great speed, elite change of direction, and he's really good just in a phone booth and can make people miss like that. So you and I talked about a lot about Jonah Coleman. We still see Cameron Davis coming back. It looks like he's going to be ready for spring practice, according to some of his comments from down in New Orleans and in Houston. So we'll kind of see how that works out. But adding Croskey-Merritt, I think that would be a fantastic addition to round out the running back room, because you get a dude who basically doubled his career yardage total after moving up a level from Alabama State to New Mexico. And then not only that, he scored 18 total touchdowns last year. This dude he's got a nose to the end zone. He just, I was really impressed with him athletically and just in everything that he could do just as a running back, where it's not just, oh yeah, he's out athleting people. He's a true running back and is really impressive at what he does.
Exactly. Well, the reason why when you're wondering, it's a good point of like, how do you balance out that room? But you also kind of do want to have a few different types of running backs. You don't want 3 battering rams, right? So I think and especially because we're all thinking kind of, well, what did Kalen DeBoer's offense and Ryan Grubb's offense look like? Jedd Fisch, the fisherman, is just as great as an X's and O's coach. And we saw kind of how well he could scheme things open. So I'm not worried about having multiple backs in the room, because first of all, again, as I said, the cream's going to rise to the top, but also you want to have a few different types. So this is a type they almost like in a different body mold, but similar mindset of this is a guy they don't have on the roster right now. No disrespect to the guys who are on the roster.
No, you're right. Where this is just a very, very different style of play, where he's somebody who I wouldn't be surprised if, and we're going to get into a receiver here in a sec, but with the just lack of bodies at receiver in the room right now, where maybe that's somebody you could see like splitting out into the slot every now and again and just kind of make him a mismatch on a linebacker. But let's talk about Audric Harris, a receiver from Bishop Gorman, who is one of Arizona's early enrollees, opted out of his NLI, and then was taking an official visit to Washington, where I like his film a lot. And I think that this is somebody where you just kind of need to add bodies at the receiver position. And you're not adding a body to add a body, but that was just be a great addition to round out the 2 true freshmen that you have right now in Justice Williams and Jason Robinson Jr.
And if you think about it, losing Tayshawn Lyons, it kind of fills that younger guy.
Right.
You don't have to, you're going into the portal in theory to go get him, but you're really not. And it's better to do that than go and get a redshirt freshman from Nebraska who you might have had a relationship with, but didn't even play with you last year. Like if you're going to, you can do that with Jordan Shaw on defense. You don't necessarily want to do that at multiple positions. So I think this is a good, and again, Bellflower kid, I believe went to St. John Boston.
No, he went to Gorman.
No, Gorman. That's right. I don't know why I thought Bellflower, but no, but there was the B. It was the Bellflower Boston. But getting it, keeping that also Bishop Gorman pipeline going, because now you're losing Rome, Eddie, all those guys. It's a different staff, but always having those elite power high schools with some connections in your program is something good for the program. And so I think that'll be something that I think will help Washington's recruiting efforts on top of getting another decent body in the room.
No, I agree with you there. And then the last guy, somebody we've talked about a little bit on the show, but it does sound more and more like he's going to end up with Jedd Fisch's staff here in Seattle. And that's a local kid. That's 4-star defensive back Rashawn Clark, where getting Clark into the room is important, not only because he's a really talented safety, but you're trying to emphasize that pipeline of keeping guys at home, where it's a kind of roundabout way in certain senses where, you get a guy like Isaiah Ward on the roster we talked about, where it's like, oh yeah, he's related to Bobby Wagner. That's awesome. But keeping guys like, as we open the show with, Landen Hatchett home, Rashawn Clark home, we're keeping those kinds of guys in the state of Washington, in the city of Seattle, is really big for the program, where you can use them as recruiters, and, keeping Caleb Presley around when he's tweeting out stuff with NIL deals and everything. That's all really great. And those are all things where you can help build on the top players in the state. Maybe, make a run at Zadrius Rainey Sale again after he decommitted following the coaching staff change, where it's a good thing to have, but he's also a fantastic football player who would fit very well at safety.
Oh, exactly. And again, I think you hit the nail on the head. Getting a local kid that actually has talent that can play right away. We've seen guys where, oh, hey, let's just take him because he didn't say kids. Like, no, you also could use some, again, pair him up with Caleb Presley down the line, those two local kids playing together for a couple of years. I mean, that's exactly what you want if you're Washington, where you don't need the whole roster to be littered with Washington guys, but you want to have enough of a presence to say, hey,
yeah,
we got the best players in the state. We coach up some of the underrated guys, and we also recruit California, West Coast, even nationally on some level, right? So I think it's all because you want to make sure you don't sell out for the state, but you want to make sure you keep the best in state. So I think that's a happy medium for what they would do with Clark.
No, I agree. And then that's something where you talk about the depth at safety right now, where he might need to play, where you look at Cameron Fabiculana, you look at Mikel Steen, where it's like, yeah, that's a nice group of starters right there. But then behind it, the depth is really thin, where Vincent Holmes is still in the transfer portal. I know he's somebody you and I were really high on. Diesel Gordon's still around, but it's very thin outside of that. So you might need to ask Rashawn Clark to play a little bit more than you want to as a true freshman. But even so, if you're that high on him, and maybe they were planning on doing that at Arizona anyways, that it's not a bad thing to have that, just doing it in Seattle, doing it for the Huskies. And I feel like that's a good place for us to wrap this one up. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. And if you're new to the channel, you like what we have to say, hey, maybe consider dropping us a follow wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere, updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure you do hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode, and hit that notifications bell so you know when we might go live, do some other things like that. It all does really help us out. Make sure to like the show. Leave us a comment down below if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. If you're audio only, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review. Again, it all really does help us out. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Tuesday.